I looked for them in the gaps, I looked for them in the hospitals, I looked for them at the Red Cross. We went through almost all of the Mexican Republic in the prisons, and they found them after 2 months, and they never told us. They never said anything to us.
Admiral Ortega Siu, the Secretary of the Navy, Vidal Francisco Soberon, and the Governor of the state of Tamaulipas, Francisco Garcia Cabeza de Vaca. They increased the presence of the Navy in Tamaulipas with the purpose of putting an end to crime linked to drug trafficking. And for a moment, the residents believed that they could finally start living in peace, but they were very wrong. On June 1st, 2018, the operation ended abruptly. Not because the project was successful, quite the opposite. Since the presence of the authorities increased, the reports of disappearances increased exponentially.
After the complaints from relatives of the disappeared in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, who pointed to members of the Navy as responsible, today, the National Human Rights Commission clarified that there is no conclusive evidence against the sailors.
A wave of disappearances was attributed to members of the Navy Secretariat. Although the relatives of more than 50 victims and human rights organizations were sure that these events were caused by the very justice system, the investigations came to a standstill as if the thousands of pieces of evidence in their favor didn't exist. Time, however, has passed slowly and very painfully for the families of the disappeared. And to this day, there is a lingering disappointment. They watch as time goes by and still don't know where their loved ones are. What happened in Nuevo Laredo? Were Mexican officers really to blame? Well, let's start with the facts. First, it must be made clear that it's difficult to explain exactly what happened to the missing people. But there are some cases like Margarita Teresa Torres, 23 years old, who was one of the victims of Nuevo Laredo, whose body was found. That revealed some details about what the Navy forces were like under their reign of terror.
Among the 13 people who were found dead is Margarita Teresa Torres, a young woman of 23, a housewife with 2 daughters, ages 4 and 6.
She left her house along with her compadre, Javier Alfaro Ortega, in the early morning of April 19th of the year, 2018 in his vehicle. They wanted to buy milk, but they never made it to the OXXO they planned to go to, located just 7 blocks from the house where she was staying.
Neither of them came back, but the car was found the next day with bullet holes.
More than a month later, on May 23rd, their remains were found on a dirt road by a woman named Erica Castro, who was looking for her husband, Jose Luis Bautista Carrillo, who had also been captured by the Marines days earlier at a junkyard where a fundraising event was being held. According to Ana Esperanza Torres, Margarita's sister, she had been searching in that same place days earlier without finding any trace of the young woman. She was sure that the body had been planted in that place days later.
They believe the body was planted since it was found 3 days after the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner received the report on the missing people from Nuevo Laredo.
Since Margarita disappeared, he started investigating and found 2 key clues. On one hand, he had the vehicle his sister had traveled in, where he found a sandal and traces of blood. On the other hand, he had the testimonies of the neighbors who claimed that the sailors took them away.
Ana says that her neighbors saw 3 Navy trucks start shooting at the vehicle. When Margarita and her companions stopped, they were forcibly taken out.
But this revelation was not a surprise. By then, everyone knew what was happening in the streets of the city. In recent months, the Navy had been carrying out abductions of people who would turn up dead the next day. Unfortunately, the case of Torres was no exception and was plagued with irregularities. The vehicle in which the young woman was captured was found by her sister, but according to what the investigators told her, it was never in that place. Did no one explain to her how the 2 bodies were found in a place the family had already searched for weeks? That way, the case stalled and no one gave the family an explanation. But why had Margarita Torres been arrested? Did she have a criminal record or was she wanted for any crime?
She wasn't involved in anything bad, not at any time. She was always dedicated to her home, to her husband, in her house, and here at my mom's house with us, but she was never involved in anything wrong.
What is believed is that the Navy carried out a series of operations to take, obviously without a court order, young people supposedly linked to organized crime. But this doubt about whether the people taken were criminals or not only creates a wave of disappearances of people who had little to do with the real enemy, organized crime. When the relatives of the disappeared found out that the Navy was involved in the kidnappings, it created a distrust in the Mexican justice system. The only thing they could do was demand answers about the whereabouts of their loved ones, hoping that some official would take their side.
They will carry out
A search for,
evidence
as well as a search for people. This search will be carried out on the borders of the states of Nuevo León, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas. Dozens of protests were held. The families carried banners, photographs, and clothing belonging to their missing loved ones. Among the protesters were people who were still searching for their relatives, many of them victims of forced disappearances attributed to the Navy Secretariat. Not only in the year 2018, but since the year 2011.
I'm looking at my son. He disappeared while heading to Nuevo Laredo on March 19th. Right now, it's been more than 2 months. A little over 2 months, and we have almost no support from the authorities.
Families were asking for their missing loved ones to be returned and even demanded that those responsible provide information about their whereabouts, even anonymously, if they were afraid to speak. In many cases, those affected were only looking for answers without any intention of seeking legal retaliation. Like a mother who said greater than. This statement honestly is very common among searching mothers. And the victims of disappearance remain an open wound in Mexico, and the demand for justice persists in the face of the indifference and neglect of the authorities. Their loved ones only ask to clarify these cases and guarantee their right to know the truth about what happened to their missing relatives.
We really don't know what happened to them. We know they disappeared them, but the authorities haven't found them or the car. We don't have any good news.
Although there were years of silence from the justice system, in 2021 there were 2 milestones that gave hope to the families of the disappeared. The arrest of 30 sailors at the beginning of April, accused of 4 disappearances, and the public apology event held in the border municipality. The Attorney General's office executed an arrest warrant against 30 naval personnel to supposedly clarify what happened between February and May of 2018 in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. Apparently, the Attorney General's office had 34 open cases regarding the disappearance of 47 people.
It should be mentioned that there are 27 people who disappeared at the hands of Navy personnel, and more than 30 investigation files are being registered and have already been registered at the Attorney General's office of the Republic.
Of the 30 detainees, 6 Marines were sent to prison for the case investigating Julio Cesar Viramontes Arredondo, who disappeared in February of the year 2018. Another 11 Marines were imprisoned for the case related to Bautista Carrillo, and there was a third file for the disappearance of 2 other young men, which happened on February 17th, in which 13 Marines were linked. But 12 of them were released after a judge accepted the injunction filed by their defense attorneys. However, in the first 2 cases, the investigators had solid evidence against the accused. One of the key pieces of evidence was the victims' cell phones, which emitted a signal for up to 2 days after their disappearance. And they located them next to the El Aguito Barracks, also known as Nuevo Laredo Sur, one of the detachments used by the Navy until June of 2018. In addition, the prosecutor's office had videos, photographs, and testimonies that pointed to the officers as being responsible for the disappearances. However, in the third case, a judge did not accept as valid the testimonies of 2 people who claimed to have seen Marines at the time of the events. But, well, they couldn't point out that they had taken the victims, and because of the disappearances. So, the government apologized, saying that nothing could redeem what happened to the victims. But they assured that they were on the path toward a truth that would bring them justice, and supposedly setting a precedent for strict oversight of naval operations in the country. The document, in fact, ended with the phrase, "The Mexican Navy offers a public apology." But was the expected justice really achieved? Well, here you go. Of the 30 sailors detained in April 2021, by 2022, only 18 remained in prison, accused of the disappearance of 4 people. However, none of them have cooperated with the authorities. None of them have given details about the modus operandi or the whereabouts of the missing people, which is the saddest part. The families of the victims still don't know the whereabouts of their loved ones. The names of the indicted sailors are also unknown, even though in some cases there are video images recorded at the moment the arbitrary arrest took place.
Of those 31 people, unfortunately, the bodies of 13 have already been found, but they were no longer alive.
7 years after the wave of disappearances in Nuevo Laredo, some families were able to say goodbye to their missing loved ones. Like in the case of the relatives of Noe, Ignacio, and Jonathan, who were able to bury them after 6 years of arbitrary disappearance and having their lives taken without reason by the Navy in February of the year 2018.
Gregoria and Maria had been searching for their missing sons, Noe Ignacio Alferez Hernandez and Jonathan Organista Ballesteros, for almost 6 years. Or do they already know where they are?
The delivery of the remains was carried out by the Office of the Attorney General of the Republic. This happened when, in February, experts from the Attorney General's office exhumed the remains of both young men to carry out genetic and anthropological tests that confirmed their identity. The remains of Jonathan and Noe Ignacio had remained in a mass grave since May 2018, where they were buried as unknowns by the authorities.
They remember them as hardworking people. Noe Ignacio was 22 years old and Jonathan was 17.
Raimundo Ramos, president of the Human Rights Committee in this city, said that a public prosecutor from the Tamaulipas Justice Prosecutor's Office concealed the discovery and the characteristics of the bodies from their families, even though they had been found half-buried on private property along the Nuevo Laredo Federal Highway.
He was a student, and after leaving high school, he would go to a car wash to help a young man, and that's when they took him.
Despite the formal reports of their disappearances made by the families, the authorities did not inform them when the remains were found. In April 2018 on the highway, they were sent to the mass grave in order to eliminate evidence and prevent them from being reunited with their families, and well, to continue with impunity and corruption.
They are exhausted by this process, they have filed various complaints, and they have faced different irregularities.
It is believed that what really happened on that fateful day was that Jonathan and Noe Ignacio were detained and the Marines killed them in an operation requested by then-Governor Francisco Javier Garcia Cabeza de Vaca from Admiral Vidal Francisco Soberon Sanz, which aimed to combat the high crime rate in the state.
Noe Ignacio and Jonathan disappeared in February 2018 after being detained by the Navy while they were in a car in the Infonavit neighborhood in Nuevo Laredo.
The operation, called Operation Laguna, was led by Admiral Marco Antonio Ortega Siu and Commander Salvador Jeronimo Rodriguez and Alfredo Reyes Mondragon. The Human Rights Committee of Nuevo Laredo denounced the abandonment by the government of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. To the families of the 54 victims of forced disappearance by members of the Navy, which occurred in the border city in 2018, and also the government of López Obrador, promised the families that those responsible for the forced disappearances would be punished, regardless of whether they belong to an armed forces institution. And well, as we already know, just promises, and that didn't happen. The 6-year term ended and they still haven't found them. And most likely that's how it's going to stay, unfortunately, in this shitty country.
Desperate and with the uncertainty of not knowing anything about their loved ones, a group of families living in Nuevo Leon went to the government palace to ask the authorities for help.
So far, there is no conviction against those responsible, even though the forced disappearances were acknowledged in a public apology. Sadly, no institution of the Mexican state has a real interest in helping to locate the victims. Meanwhile, their families have been denied follow-up meetings on their cases by the Ministry of the Interior, the Executive Commission for Victim Assistance, and the Attorney General's Office.
The affected people are from Nuevo Leon, but they disappeared in Nuevo Laredo under different circumstances.
They are all aware of the disappearances in Tamaulipas, but none of them want to help. The Secretariat of Government left out 20 suspects to avoid exposing the state operation in that city. And the prosecutor's office has not been able to prove the direct responsibility of 24 Marines in 4 investigation files, and they had to be released by a federal judge. And for the families, this is an insult to the 54 victims by the Secretariat, especially after they denied the existence of forced disappearances in Mexico. Of the 54 victims of disappearance, 19 were found dead by their families, of whom 3 were minors and 2 were women.
He went to Nuevo Laredo for some people, and we never heard from him again.
To date, the Special Prosecutor's Office for the Investigation of Disappearance Crimes has not been able to locate 32 victims, among them 3 women and 2 minors. But why is this? Well, apparently the Attorney General's office has been delaying the investigations so that they don't end up harming the high-ranking officials who were really the ones pulling the strings behind these events. And the thing is, the disappearances in Nuevo Laredo were a state operation, not just a regular operation that they weren't aware of. The investigations only went as far as Captain Alfredo Reyes Mondragon, head of the Special Operations Unit in Nuevo Laredo. However, even though his name came up in all 3 disappearances that went to trial, he was only prosecuted for the cases of Alferez Hernandez and Ballesteros Loza. In addition, he was one of the Marines who were released after a federal judge found no evidence to keep them in prison. The testimonies presented during the hearings prove, however, that he was aware of the other incidents, since many of the reports were signed in his own handwriting. It was no surprise, however, to anyone that the hand chain was not analyzed during the hearings. The complaints indicated that the then chief of the UNOPES, Marco Antonio Ortega Q, was one of those responsible for ordering these disappearances. However, this admiral was never questioned by the prosecutors. In 2019, he left his command post to move to an office position and later took over the Public Security Secretariat. Additionally, the investigation also did not review key pieces of evidence such as fingerprints, videos of arrests made by uniformed men, and information requested by the families.
And not only will people be searched for, but also evidence to prove that at some point these people were in the places indicated by the families.
The authorities blatantly ignored, to put it a certain way, a video that showed the arrest of Jose Luis Bautista Carrillo, who was 32 years old, in front of dozens of witnesses in an auto parts store on May 16, 2018. Weapons experts and forensic specialists from Amnesty International analyzed the videos and concluded that the suspects appeared to have professional training, and they were equipped with vehicles, uniforms, and weapons, including rifles that closely resemble those used by the Navy. In another surveillance video, armed and uniformed men were shown entering the house of Jose Daniel Trejo Garcia in Nuevo Laredo on March 27, 2018. Then they left the house with 2 men whom they put into their vehicles. Amnesty International verified that the date and geographic location of the video matched the coordinates from the complaint made by the wife of the victim.
Juan Gerardo Treviño Sánchez, El Huevo, leader of the Zetas or the Northeast Cartel, is behind the disappearances that are presumed to have been committed by criminal cells that use clothing similar to that of naval personnel.
Even though the authorities reported that sometimes criminal groups disguise themselves as security forces, Amnesty International stated that there was enough evidence for the authorities to conduct investigations into the Navy's involvement in these disappearances, which obviously did not happen. So much protests and demands for justice have caused witnesses of the kidnappings and relatives of victims to become victims of threats, harassment, assaults, and even deprivation of liberty, especially after filing complaints with the authorities.
They extort us and call us and ask us for money and tell us that they have him, so they have him one way or another. We don't know what to do anymore. We just ask God to be with him.
And finally, in the last 20 years, there was no place in Mexico with more missing people per capita than in Tamaulipas. Although Jalisco dominates the total numbers of disappearances, when you convert it to rates per population, Tamaulipas tops the list by a wide margin. They were taken alive, and we want them back alive. Most of the disappearances in Tamaulipas are concentrated along the border, particularly in the municipalities of Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros. 58% of the disappearances in Tamaulipas happen in these 3 municipalities. The link between the border situation and the disappearances is undeniable.
It's not sleeping, it's asking God for him to be safe. He has a 3-month-old baby girl. It's very, very, very exhausting. And even more so because they extort us, they call us, they ask us for money, and they tell us they have him.
It's hard not to link the problem to the context of organized crime in Tamaulipas. Matamoros, the municipality that has recorded the most disappearances in the last 20 years, is the operation center of the Gulf Cartel. Reynosa and Nuevo Laredo, which follow closely behind, have been key municipalities for the growth of Los Zetas and the Northeast Cartel. The first spike in disappearances happened in the years 2011 and 2012 during the height of the Last Letter Group and their conflict with the Gulf Cartel. The second spike in disappearances occurred in the years 2016 and 2017 after the creation of the Northeast Cartel, which came from the Zetas and their conflict with the Gulf Cartel.
The situation is worrying.
There are more than 90 reports of missing people. Many of the cases happen on the Monterrey-Nuevo Laredo highway.
The border between Tamaulipas and Texas has been experiencing successive waves of violence for more than 20 years, making the area one of the most dangerous in the country. The discovery of a new extermination center near the Monterrey-Nuevo Laredo highway, also known as the Highway of Death, only made the situation even worse.
Some call it the Highway of Terror, or the Bermuda Triangle, between Nuevo León and Tamaulipas.
On the property, which is quite large, there is a clandestine cemetery with charred skeletal remains. Apparently, it was used for several years and continued operating until shortly before it was discovered in 2021.
Exactly a year ago, Ricardo Valdez and Jorge Arevalo left very early to work at a company in Nuevo Laredo. They disappeared on this road I just described to you. Their families are looking for them.
That year, there were 77 disappearances along the 219-kilometer stretch of the Monterrey-Nuevo León highway, of which only 18 people were found alive. And the only thing they said was that armed men forced them to stop on the highway and took their vehicles. Among the missing were 31 trailer drivers, 32 private car drivers, 8 private company drivers, 3 Didi drivers, 2 Uber drivers, and 1 taxi driver. Most of the victims were men between 18 and 40 years old, and they were originally from Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Estado de Mexico, San Luis Potosí, and Veracruz. And one of the victims also stated that a group of armed men deprived him of his freedom on that highway. And then they took him to a room where other people were. They made them suffer during interrogations.
They don't just kidnap one person, they kidnap an entire family.
The initial investigations by the Mexican authorities confirmed that the disappearances were the work of organized crime and the struggle between rival gangs. On one hand, the authorities have attributed the disappearances to criminal groups that are behind the smugglers responsible for transporting migrants to the border. But is this the only plausible hypothesis? Well, I don't think so. And that's because of the disappearance of the 54 people in Nuevo Laredo at the hands of the Navy. It's impossible not to think that the authorities could have had something to do with these events. We must not forget that apparently members of the armed forces enjoy maximum impunity. Everything is set up so that justice stops working when the federal forces dedicated to public security break the law and harm their citizens.
But this has to end. I mean, it can't go on like this. It can't go on like this. Do you have any idea how much pain those people cause to families? We've been devastated since that day.
Finally, and sadly, it seems there will be no consequences for the sailors and the high-ranking officers behind them, who made more than 50 people disappear in that state, or rather, in the municipality of Nuevo Laredo. The worst part is that forced disappearances continue as if nothing had changed, and it seems like they have no end. And not just in Tamaulipas, because the crisis of missing people in Jalisco is truly alarming. I'm referring to these last few years.